to the soothing accounts of truly remarkable lives. Our journey this evening carries us back over 2,000 years to a world of shimmering desert palaces, papyrus scrolls crackling in lamplight, and a woman whose intelligence and ambition would make her the most powerful ruler of her age. Her name was Cleopatra VII. Her stage, the final act of an ancient civilization that had already endured for 3 millennia. Before we properly begin our exploration of this extraordinary life, just a brief thought. If these calm journeys through history help you settle into sleep, please consider taking a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps other curious minds discover these stories, and we're always eager to hear from you. So let us know in the comments what aspects of Cleopatra's story resonate with you and which historical figure you'd like us to explore next. Now, Cleopatra's name gets thrown around quite a bit, usually attached to images of Elizabeth Taylor in elaborate eye makeup or vague notions of seduction and asp bites. But strip away the Hollywood embellishments, and you'll find something far more compelling. A polyglot scholar who spoke 9 languages, a skilled naval commander, a cunning diplomat who navigated the treacherous waters of Roman politics with remarkable dexterity. And yes, a woman who understood that in a world where women were expected to be silent, beauty and charm could be wielded as effectively as any sword. Her story is one of desperate gambles and calculated risks, of a kingdom trying to maintain its independence as the Roman Republic devoured the Mediterranean world piece by piece. It's a tale of 2 legendary love affairs that would inspire poets and playwrights for millennia. But more than that, it's the story of the last chapter of pharaonic Egypt, that impossibly ancient civilization that had built pyramids when Rome was still a collection of mud huts. So, as the day winds down and the modern world fades, let's journey back to Alexandria, to the marble palaces overlooking a harbor filled with grain ships, to the great library where scholars debated under columned porticos, to the throne room where a young woman would stake everything on her intelligence, her courage, and her iron determination to protect her kingdom. This is the bedtime biography of Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt. Chapter 1. A Princess in a Dying Dynasty. The story begins not with Cleopatra's birth, but with understanding the world into which she was born. The year is 69 BCE, though she would enter a realm still using the old Egyptian calendar, where time was measured by the flooding of the Nile and the reign of pharaohs stretched back into the mists of antiquity. Egypt in 69 BCE was a paradox, simultaneously one of the richest kingdoms in the Mediterranean and one of the most vulnerable. The dynasty into which Cleopatra was born, the Ptolemaic dynasty, had ruled Egypt for nearly 250 years, but they were Greeks, not Egyptians. Her ancestor, Ptolemy I, had been one of Alexander the Great's generals who'd carved out Egypt as his share when Alexander's empire was divided after the conqueror's death. For nearly 3 centuries, the Ptolemies had ruled from Alexandria, that gleaming city Alexander himself had founded on Egypt's Mediterranean coast. By the time of Cleopatra's birth, the dynasty had fallen into the pattern that would doom so many royal houses. In inbreeding, palace intrigue, murders, and a dangerous dependency on Rome's goodwill. The Ptolemies married their siblings to keep the bloodline pure and the succession undisputed, a practice they'd adopted from the ancient pharaohs they claimed to succeed. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, who bore the rather optimistic nickname Auletes, meaning the flute player, was weak, corrupt, and deeply unpopular with his subjects. The Alexandria of Cleopatra's childhood was still the greatest city of the ancient world, rivaling even Rome itself. The great lighthouse of Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, guided ships into the harbor from miles out to sea. The famous library of Alexandria, though past its peak, still housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls containing the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world. The museum, attached to the library, hosted scholars, mathematicians, astronomers, and physicians from across the known world. Walking through the royal quarter, young Cleopatra would have passed temples dedicated to both Greek and Egyptian gods, evidence of the cultural fusion that characterized Ptolemaic Egypt. The architecture blended Greek columns with Egyptian obelisks. Festivals honored Zeus and Amun-Ra with equal fervor. The city's population was a cosmopolitan mix of Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Syrians, and merchants from as far away as India. But for all Alexandria's glory, the royal palace was a nest of vipers. Cleopatra was not her father's firstborn, nor even his second. She had at least 3 older siblings, and the question of succession was always fraught with danger in the Ptolemaic court. Royal children learned early to watch their backs, to trust no one completely, and to understand that family members could become deadly enemies overnight. We know relatively little about Cleopatra's early childhood, but we can piece together a picture from what we know of royal Ptolemaic education and the skills she would later display. She would have been educated by the finest tutors available, likely including scholars from the museum. Unlike her ancestors, who had stubbornly refused to learn the language of the Egyptian people they ruled, Cleopatra would become the first Ptolemaic ruler in 3 centuries to actually speak Egyptian. In addition, she learned Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Aramaic, and several other languages, a linguistic gift that would prove invaluable in her later diplomatic career. Her education would have covered rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, music, and medicine. She would have read Homer and Herodotus, studied the geometries of Euclid, and perhaps attended lectures at the museum. The Ptolemaic court, for all its violence and intrigue, maintained the Greek love of learning and intellectual discourse. But the most important lessons Cleopatra learned had nothing to do with books. In 58 BCE, when she was about 11 years old, her father was driven from Egypt by Alexandrian mobs, angry at his heavy taxation and his subservience to Rome. Ptolemy Auletes fled to Rome to beg for military assistance to reclaim his throne, leaving Egypt in chaos. What happened during the next 3 years is murky, but it appears that Cleopatra's older sister Berenice seized power and ruled as queen. For 3 years, the young Cleopatra watched as her sister sat on the throne that should have been their father's. She learned that power in Egypt was never secure, that the people's loyalty could shift like desert sands, and that Rome's shadow loomed over every Egyptian throne. When her father finally returned in 55 BCE, backed by Roman soldiers, his first act was to have Berenice executed. Cleopatra, now 14, witnessed her sister's murder, a brutal lesson in the price of losing the Game of Thrones. Her father's reign after his return was brief and marked by his desperate attempts to pay back the Roman creditors who had financed his restoration. The flute player died in 51 BCE, leaving Egypt bankrupt and his succession unclear. In his will, he named two of his children as joint rulers, the 18-year-old Cleopatra and her younger brother, the 10-year-old Ptolemy XIII. Following Ptolemaic tradition, they were to marry and rule together. But Cleopatra had not watched her sister die and her father grovel before Rome only to share power with a child. From the moment she assumed the throne, it was clear that she intended to rule alone. The young woman who took the double crown of Egypt in 51 BCE was brilliant, ambitious, and utterly determined. She also inherited a kingdom on the brink of collapse, with empty treasuries, restless subjects, and vultures in Rome circling ever closer. The stage was set for one of history's most dramatic stories, a tale of intelligence pitted against impossible odds, of desperate gambles and audacious risks. The girl who had grown up in the shadow of Rome's power was about to step into the full glare of history's spotlight, and the world would never forget her. Chapter 2. The Young Queen and the Gathering Storm. The early months of Cleopatra's reign began inauspiciously. Egypt, for all its ancient glory and legendary wealth, was facing a crisis that no amount of royal charisma could immediately solve. The Nile, that life-giving artery upon which all Egyptian civilization depended, failed to flood properly in the years following her accession. In an agricultural society where everything depended on the river's annual inundation, this meant famine, unrest, and economic devastation. Ancient papyri from this period, preserved in Egypt's dry climate, speak of high grain prices and hungry people. Cleopatra, unlike many rulers who might have remained isolated in their palaces, understood that her legitimacy depended on her ability to provide for her subjects. She ordered grain reserves opened and distributed. She made public appearances at Egyptian religious festivals, honoring the traditional gods and presenting herself not merely as a Greek ruler, but as a true pharaoh, the divine intermediary between the Egyptian people and their gods. This was revolutionary. For nearly 3 centuries, the Ptolemies had ruled Egypt but remained fundamentally Greek. They spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, and regarded Egyptian religion and culture with the polite condescension of colonial overlords. Cleopatra understood that this distance from her Egyptian subjects weakened her position, so she did what none of her ancestors had done. She learned to read and write hieroglyphics. She participated actively in Egyptian religious ceremonies. She traveled up the Nile to Thebes and Memphis, showing herself to the Egyptian people in their own cities, not just the Greek enclave of Alexandria. there's a fascinating inscription from early in her reign where she's depicted in traditional pharaonic style, wearing the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, making offerings to the goddess Isis. The accompanying hieroglyphs identify her with Isis herself, the divine mother goddess who was the most beloved deity in Egypt. This was brilliant political theater. By associating herself with Isis, Cleopatra was claiming divine authority in terms her Egyptian subjects would understand and accept. But political theater, however skillfully performed, couldn't resolve the fundamental problem facing Egypt: Rome. By the time Cleopatra took the throne, the Roman Republic was the undisputed superpower of the Mediterranean world. The independent kingdoms that still existed did so only because Rome hadn't yet bothered to absorb them. Egypt's wealth, its grain harvests that fed the Mediterranean world, its strategic position, all made it an incredibly tempting target. Making matters worse, Rome itself was tearing itself apart. The republican system that had built an empire was collapsing under the weight of civil wars and personal rivalries. Powerful generals commanded loyal armies and looked at each other with murder in their eyes. Pompey the Great, Julius Caesar, and Marcus Crassus had formed an uneasy alliance called the First Triumvirate, but everyone knew it couldn't last. When these titans inevitably clashed, Egypt would be caught in the middle. Cleopatra's youth and her gender made her vulnerable in ways that a male ruler might not have been. In the ancient world, women who wielded power did so at their peril, always vulnerable to charges of impropriety or inadequacy. The advisors who surrounded her young brother-husband Ptolemy XIII saw an opportunity. Why should they serve a woman when they could control a pliable boy king? By 49 BCE, just 2 years into her reign, Cleopatra found herself outmaneuvered by her brother's regents, particularly a eunuch named Pothinus and a general named Achillas. They turned Ptolemy against his sister wife and had Cleopatra driven from Alexandria. For the second time in her life, she watched a co-ruler seize power while she was forced into exile. But Cleopatra was not her father. Rather than flee to Rome to beg for help, she retreated to the eastern edge of Egypt, near the border with Judea. There, displaying the audacity that would characterize her entire reign, she began raising an army. A 21-year-old woman, driven from her throne, was preparing to fight her way back to power. The civil war between Cleopatra and her brother might have remained a local Egyptian affair, just another round in the Ptolemaic dynasty's endless cycle of family violence. But in the summer of 48 BCE, events in the larger Roman world intervened in a way that would change everything. Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, the two most powerful men in Rome, had finally gone to war with each other. Pompey, defeated at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece, fled south with Caesar in pursuit. Where would a defeated Roman general go? To Egypt, of course, Rome's wealthy client kingdom, where Pompey had friends, and where his help in restoring Cleopatra's father years earlier should count for something. As Pompey's ships approached Alexandria, The advisors surrounding young Ptolemy XIII faced a choice: Pompey or Caesar. Back the wrong, Roman and Egypt might face invasion. Back the right one, and they might secure Egypt's independence. They made their decision. As Pompey's boat approached the harbor, Egyptian soldiers rowed out to meet him. Pompey, relieved to see what looked like a friendly welcome, transferred to their smaller vessel. As soon as he was aboard, they murdered him, cutting off his head to present as a gift to Julius Caesar when he arrived. The boy king's advisors thought they were being clever. They were actually condemning themselves to death and handing Egypt to Cleopatra on a silver platter. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria a few days later, expecting to find his enemy Pompey, he was instead presented with Pompey's severed head. The reaction was not what Ptolemy's advisors expected. Caesar, for all his ruthlessness, was genuinely horrified. Pompey had been his son-in-law, and however much they'd become enemies, there were protocols to these things. Romans killed Romans, certainly, but with dignity. To have outsiders murder a Roman general and think Caesar would be grateful? It was an insult. More than that, it was an opportunity. Caesar was in Alexandria with legions of soldiers, and Egypt was in the middle of a succession crisis. The country was wealthy but weak, divided but valuable, and somewhere out there, driven from her throne by a 13-year-old boy and his scheming advisors, was the rightful queen, brilliant, desperate, and about to make the boldest move of her young life. Chapter 3. The Carpet and the Conqueror. Picture Alexandria in October of 48 BC. Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in the Roman world, has taken up residence in the royal palace. He's 52 years old, battle-hardened, politically brilliant, and deeply in debt from the civil war he's just won. Nominally, he's in Egypt to collect on debts that Ptolemy Auletes owed to Roman creditors. Really, he's there because he can be, because Egypt is rich and vulnerable, and because the murder of Pompey gives him an excuse to involve himself in Egyptian affairs. Young Ptolemy XIII and his advisors are growing increasingly nervous. Caesar has made it clear that he expects both royal siblings to present themselves so he can arbitrate their dispute. But Cleopatra is outside the city with an army, and bringing her into Alexandria might upset the balance of power they've so carefully maintained. They stall, making excuses, hoping Caesar will lose interest and leave. Cleopatra, camped with her forces near Pelusium on Egypt's eastern frontier, understands that this is the moment everything will be decided. Caesar is in Alexandria, holding court in her palace, deciding Egypt's fate. She needs to reach him before her brother's advisors can poison his mind against her. But Alexandria is held by Ptolemy's forces. The moment she tries to enter the city, she'll be arrested or killed. What happened next has become one of history's most famous stories, though the details have been embellished and romanticized over the centuries. According to Plutarch, writing a century and a half later, Cleopatra had herself smuggled into the palace in a rolled-up carpet, or possibly a large laundry sack. Her Sicilian friend Apollodorus carried her through the city after dark, navigating past guards and into Caesar's quarters. Imagine Caesar's surprise when Apollodorus unrolled the carpet and out stepped the Queen of Egypt. It was theatrical, audacious, and brilliant. In one move, Cleopatra had demonstrated her courage, her resourcefulness, and her absolute determination to claim her throne. She'd also created a situation that was intensely personal and private. She wasn't approaching Caesar through formal diplomatic channels where her brother's advisors could interfere. She was there, in his quarters, a young woman making her case directly to the most powerful man in the world. What did they talk about that night? We can only guess, but Cleopatra was nothing if not a skilled rhetorician. She would have made her case carefully. Egypt needed stability. Her brother was a child controlled by ambitious men. She was the legitimate heir, educated, capable, and willing to work with Rome rather than against it. She spoke to Caesar in his own language, Latin, but with the wit and polish of someone who'd been educated in Greek philosophy and rhetoric. And yes, there was attraction. Ancient sources make it clear that Cleopatra's legendary allure wasn't about conventional beauty. Plutarch explicitly states that her looks were not absolutely incomparable, but that her conversation was utterly captivating, and her presence, combined with her intelligence and charm, made her irresistible. Caesar, for all his political genius, was famously susceptible to intelligent, powerful women. His affair with Servilia, the mother of Marcus Brutus, was common knowledge in Rome. By morning, Caesar had made his decision. He would support Cleopatra's claim to the throne. When Ptolemy XIII was summoned to the palace and found his sister there, standing beside Caesar, he reportedly threw off his crown and stormed out, crying betrayal. The boy king's advisors realized they'd lost and did the only thing they could. They raised Alexandria against Caesar, trapping him and Cleopatra in the palace quarter with only a few thousand Roman soldiers against an entire city. What followed was the Alexandrian War, a desperate struggle that lasted months. Caesar and Cleopatra were besieged in the palace and the area around the harbor. Ptolemy's forces, led by the general Achillas, outnumbered the Romans significantly. The fighting was brutal and chaotic. At one point, the famous Library of Alexandria caught fire, though exactly how much was destroyed remains a matter of historical debate. During those months of siege, something remarkable happened. Cleopatra and Caesar, trapped together in the palace under constant threat of death, became lovers. She was 21. He was 52. She was fighting for her kingdom. He was cementing his control of the Roman world. Together, they held out against overwhelming odds, their fates intertwined by circumstance and choice. Relief finally came in the form of Roman reinforcements arriving from Syria. With their help, Caesar broke the siege. In the final battle, young Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile, trying to flee the Roman advance. The war was over. Cleopatra had won, though at tremendous cost. Alexandria was damaged, thousands had died, and Egypt was now unmistakably under Roman influence. But Cleopatra was queen, undisputed for the first time. Following tradition, she married another younger brother, the 11-year-old Ptolemy XIV, but everyone understood this was purely ceremonial. She ruled Egypt alone, with Caesar's backing and Roman legions stationed in the country to ensure stability. In the spring of 47 BCE, Cleopatra and Caesar took a cruise down the Nile. It wasn't just a romantic getaway, though it was certainly that. It was a royal progress, a carefully orchestrated display of Cleopatra's power and her alliance with Rome. They traveled in a magnificent barge, accompanied by a fleet of 400 ships. Along the way, they stopped at ancient Egyptian temples and cities. Caesar, who fancied himself an intellectual, was fascinated by Egypt's antiquity. His own city, Rome, was barely 5 centuries old. Egypt's monuments had been ancient when Rome was founded. By the time they returned to Alexandria, Cleopatra was pregnant. In June of 47 BCE, she gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy Caesar, though everyone called him Caesarion, Little Caesar. Cleopatra proclaimed him co-ruler, though he was an infant. The message was clear. This child, half Egyptian and half Roman, half pharaoh and half conqueror's son, represented the future she envisioned. An Egypt aligned with Rome but independent, strong enough to survive in the new world order that was emerging from the Roman civil wars. Caesar, whatever his personal feelings for the child, couldn't publicly acknowledge him. He had a wife in Rome, Calpurnia, and Roman law was complicated regarding children born outside of legal marriage. But he didn't deny Caesarion either. The boy's existence was an open secret, and in Alexandria, he was celebrated as the son of the greatest Roman and the greatest Egyptian. In the summer of 46 BCE, Caesar finally left Egypt, drawn back to Rome by political necessity. He had battles to fight in North Africa and Spain, a triumph to celebrate, and a republic to reshape according to his vision. But he promised Cleopatra he would send for her, that she would see Rome herself. She arrived in 46 BCE, traveling with an enormous entourage that included Ptolemy XIV, young Caesarion, attendants, scholars, and servants. Caesar installed her in his villa across the Tiber River, technically outside Rome proper, which helped avoid some of the political complications of having a foreign queen actually in the city. But everyone knew she was there, living in Caesar's house, the mother of his son, conducting herself with all the dignity and presence of a ruling monarch. Roman society didn't know quite what to make of her. On one hand, she was exotic, fascinating, impossibly wealthy and foreign. Her presence at dinner parties was considered a coup. On the other hand, she was a foreigner, a woman wielding power, and disturbingly close to Caesar, who was already making some Romans nervous with his accumulation of power and honors. Cleopatra spent over a year in Rome, and we can glimpse her impact through scattered references in contemporary sources. Cicero, Rome's greatest orator, met her and afterward wrote sourly to his friend Atticus that he hated the queen's arrogance. Clearly, Cleopatra had not bent over backward to charm the prickly senator. Others were more impressed. She held court in Caesar's villa, discussing philosophy with scholars and probably quietly lobbying for Egypt's interests with influential Romans. Caesar had a golden statue of Cleopatra erected in the temple of Venus Genetrix, his family's divine ancestress. It was an extraordinary honor, blurring the lines between human and divine, between Roman and Egyptian. Some saw it as romantic tribute. Others saw it as one more sign that Caesar was becoming too powerful, too king-like, too un-Roman. The Ides of March, 44 BCE, shattered everything. Caesar was assassinated in the Senate, stabbed 23 times by men who claimed they were saving the Republic from tyranny. Cleopatra was still in Rome when it happened. The news must have reached her within hours. Caesar, her lover and protector, the father of her son, the man on whom all her plans depended, was dead. Her position immediately became precarious. The assassins might target her next, or the chaos following Caesar's death might make Rome dangerous for foreign monarchs. Within weeks, she'd packed up her household and sailed back to Egypt, taking Caesarion with her. She'd gambled on Caesar and won a throne. Now that gamble had ended with Caesar bleeding out on the Senate floor. Back in Alexandria, she faced a different kind of crisis. Egypt needed stability, but with Caesar dead, where would she find protection from Rome's predators? Her young brother-husband, Ptolemy XIV, died shortly after her return, possibly of natural causes, possibly not. Ancient sources hint darkly that Cleopatra had him poisoned to eliminate any potential rival to Caesarion. We'll never know for certain, but it's telling that no one at the time seemed surprised by his death. She was 25 years old, a widow queen with a 3-year-old son, ruling one of the world's wealthiest kingdoms, while Rome tore itself apart in yet another civil war. Caesar's assassins, led by Brutus and Cassius, were raising armies to fight Caesar's followers, led by Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. Both sides would expect Egypt's grain and Egypt's gold to help their cause. Cleopatra understood that neutrality was impossible. She would have to choose sides again, bet everything on another Roman strongman, and hope she'd picked the winner. The young woman who'd smuggled herself into Caesar's presence in a carpet was about to face her greatest test yet. And waiting in the wings was a Roman general who would become the second great love of her life and, ultimately, the architect of her destruction. Chapter 4. The Summons to Tarsus. The 3 years following Caesar's assassination were chaotic for everyone in the Mediterranean world, but especially for Egypt. Cleopatra found herself in an impossible position. 2 rival factions were battling for control of Rome, both claiming to represent Caesar's legacy and both expecting Egypt to support them. Brutus and Cassius, the tyrannicides who'd killed Caesar, controlled the eastern provinces and sent envoys demanding money and ships. Meanwhile, Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, who'd formed the second triumvirate to avenge Caesar, sent their own demands. Cleopatra tried to play a careful game, giving minimal support to both sides while strengthening Egypt's internal position. She'd learned from watching her father that dependence on Rome was dangerous, but she'd also learned from Caesar that Rome's power was unavoidable. Her strategy was survival. Keep Egypt rich, keep Egypt armed, and wait to see which Roman faction would ultimately triumph before fully committing. In 42 BCE, the question was answered at the Battle of Philippi in Macedonia. Mark Antony and Octavian crushed the forces of Brutus and Cassius, ending any hope that the old republic might be restored. The assassins were dead, both by their own hands, after the defeat. The future belonged to the second triumvirate, with the vast Roman territories divided among the three men. Octavian got the west, including Italy and Gaul. Lepidus got Africa, and Mark Antony got the wealthy eastern provinces, including oversight of client kingdoms like Egypt. Mark Antony was, in many ways, the opposite of Julius Caesar. Where Caesar had been calculating and controlled, Antony was passionate and impulsive. Where Caesar had been famously abstemious, barely drinking wine, Antony was legendary for his appetites. He loved wine, food, spectacle, and women with an enthusiasm that both charmed and scandalized his contemporaries. He was also genuinely talented, a brave soldier, a skilled general, and when he chose to be, a capable administrator. After Philippi, Antony was the most powerful man in the Mediterranean. He set himself up in Athens, then moved to Ephesus, holding court and receiving emissaries from the various kingdoms and cities under Roman influence. He needed money desperately. Civil wars were expensive, and his soldiers expected to be paid. Egypt, the wealthiest kingdom in his sphere of influence, would be expected to contribute substantially. But there was a problem. Reports had reached Antony that Egypt's queen had not been entirely loyal during the civil war. Sources claimed she'd sent ships to help Brutus and Cassius, or at least had maintained contact with them. Whether these charges were true or merely the usual gossip and misinformation that surrounded any powerful woman, they gave Antony an excuse to summon Cleopatra to account for her actions. The summons came in 41 BCE. Queen Cleopatra was to present herself at Tarsus, a city on the southern coast of Asia Minor, to answer questions about her loyalty to the triumvirate. For Cleopatra, now 28 years old, it was a moment of crisis, an opportunity eerily similar to her first meeting with Caesar. Once again, she was being summoned by a Roman strongman who controlled Egypt's fate. Once again, she would need to be brilliant, bold, and unforgettable. She took her time responding to the summons, letting weeks pass before sending word that she would come. When she finally set sail from Alexandria, she did so with a fleet and an entourage designed to make an unforgettable impression. She wasn't coming as a suppliant begging for forgiveness. She was coming as the Queen of Egypt, ancient and powerful, graciously consenting to meet with a Roman administrator. The arrival at Tarsus has been described by ancient historians particularly Plutarch, in terms so vivid and cinematic that they've inspired countless paintings, plays, and films. Cleopatra sailed up the river Cydnus in a magnificent barge that seemed designed to evoke divine imagery. The stern was gilded, the sails were purple silk, and the silver oars moved to the sound of flutes and harps. She herself reclined under a canopy decorated in gold, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, attended by servants costumed as cupids and sea nymphs. The spectacle was deliberate and deeply meaningful. In Greek mythology, Aphrodite had risen from the sea foam. In Roman religion, Venus, Aphrodite's equivalent, was the ancestor of Julius Caesar's family, and thus of Caesar himself. By presenting herself as Aphrodite, Cleopatra was associating herself with divine imagery that Romans would recognize and respect, while simultaneously reminding Antony that she was the mother of Caesar's son. The performance was so spectacular that the people of Tarsus rushed to the riverbank to watch, leaving Antony sitting alone in the market square where he'd arranged to receive the Egyptian queen. Word spread through the streets that Aphrodite had come to feast with Dionysus for the good of Asia. The comparison to Dionysus, the god of wine and revelry, was pointed. Antony himself cultivated associations with Dionysus, seeing the god's combination of military power and joyous abandon as reflecting his own character. When Antony sent messengers inviting Cleopatra to dinner, she politely declined and instead invited him to dine with her on her barge. It was a subtle but important reversal of power dynamics. She would not come to him. He would come to her, and he did. That first banquet aboard Cleopatra's barge was apparently so lavish, so extravagantly beautiful, that it became legendary. Plutarch describes the lighting alone, countless lamps and torches arranged in elaborate patterns, as being beyond description in its beauty. Over the following nights, they continued to meet, with Cleopatra hosting elaborate dinners that displayed Egypt's wealth while she charmed, entertained, and negotiated with Antony. Unlike her time with Caesar, which had begun with desperation and siege, this courtship was leisurely and luxurious. Antony was no less powerful than Caesar had been, but he was more easily swayed by pleasure and spectacle. Ancient sources emphasize Cleopatra's conversation and personality rather than her physical beauty. Plutarch, who, as we've mentioned, wrote that her looks were not incomparable, stressed her voice, her wit, and her ability to adapt her mood and manner to suit her companion. She could speak to Antony in his own language about military matters, joke with him in the coarse way he enjoyed, and also discourse on philosophy, literature, and the arts. She was, in short, the perfect companion for a man of Antony's temperament. By the time the meetings at Tarsus concluded, Antony was completely captivated. Whatever questions he'd had about Cleopatra's loyalty during the civil war were forgotten or dismissed. She returned to Egypt with assurances of Rome's continued friendship. But more than that, she'd invited Antony to visit Alexandria, and he'd accepted. He would come during the winter, when campaigning season was over and he could spare time from his military and administrative duties. Antony arrived in Alexandria in the winter of 41 to 40 BCE. and what was planned as a brief visit stretched into months. Cleopatra showed him the city's wonders, the library, the museum, the temples, and the palace quarter. But more than that, she gave him something he craved, a respite from the responsibilities and dangers of Roman politics, a place where he could simply enjoy himself without watching his back for assassins. They formed a private club they called the Inimitable Livers, dedicated to pleasure and excess. The membership consisted of Cleopatra, Antony, and their close friends. They spent their days and nights in feasting, drinking, gambling, and various entertainments. Ancient sources are full of anecdotes about their extravagances. Stories of Cleopatra betting Antony she could spend 10 million sesterces on a single dinner, then winning the bet by dissolving a massive pearl earring in vinegar and drinking it. Tales of Antony and Cleopatra disguising themselves and wandering the streets of Alexandria at night, playing pranks on unsuspecting citizens. These stories, even if embellished, reveal something important. For the first time in years, perhaps in her entire life, Cleopatra could relax. With Caesar, she'd always been conscious of performing, of maintaining the alliance that kept her throne secure. With Antony, there was genuine pleasure and companionship. He wasn't just her political protector. He was her partner in creating a life that balanced duty with joy. But reality couldn't be kept at bay forever. In the spring of 40 BCE, news arrived from Rome that demanded Antony's immediate attention. His wife, Fulvia, and his brother had raised a rebellion against Octavian in Italy. The triumvirate was fracturing. Antony needed to return to the west to sort out his affairs and prevent Octavian from seizing complete control. He left Alexandria, promising to return, and Cleopatra was left once again to wonder whether she'd gambled correctly. She was pregnant with twins, and while Antony had made promises, she'd heard promises from powerful Roman men before. Her fate and Egypt's depended on Antony's continued success and his continued commitment to their alliance. The twins were born in the winter of 40 BCE. Cleopatra named them Alexander Helios, sun, and Cleopatra Selene, moon. The names were significant, evoking Alexander the Great and connecting her children to both Macedonian and Egyptian royal traditions. But they were also audacious. By naming her son Alexander, she was hinting at ambitions that stretched far beyond Egypt's borders, dreams of recreating Alexander's empire under her family's rule. Meanwhile, Antony was having his own difficulties. His wife Fulvia died, and he found himself forced to make peace with Octavian. As part of the reconciliation, he agreed to marry Octavian's sister, Octavia. It was pure political calculation, cementing the alliance between the two most powerful men in Rome. But for Cleopatra, hearing the news in